And there are passages in the Old Testament that tell you to stone a girl or a woman who's not a virgin on her wedding night, take her to her father's doorstep and stone her to death, right? And or
we can probably agree that those are wrong. So
yeah, there's another point of agreement. But you don't have to read the book to the end to know that it's wrong. You can get that from the paragraph.
Come on now.
Yeah, but
come on. What are you going to say back to that, Jordan?
This is what I said. I didn't say you had to read to the end of the book to know that it's wrong. I said you needed to read to the end of the book to contextualize those statements within the whole. I didn't.
Do you really need to?
But there's no exculpatory context to those kinds of statements. That's on some levels the best thing that's ever going to happen, because it's showing you that in this case Jesus is going to come back and throw the sinners into a lake of fire. And I've read to the end of the book. It's pretty scary at the end as well. I mean, Revelation is
It's pretty scary at the end as well, huh? Sam Harris versus Jordan Peterson, God, Atheism, the Bible, Jesus. Part 1, presented by Pangburn. So you're going to need to buckle up, because this is going to be a series of reactions. It's a longer set of discussions, debates, and I have never watched thoroughly. I've seen a clip out of this at a certain place where I know Sam had a gotcha moment. So there's definitely some gotcha moments, but let's stop wasting any time and get right in, and I think I'll probably skip the introduction, but let's get started.
Please put your hands together for Brett Weinstein, Jordan Peterson, and Sam Harris.
When Jordan and I first decided to do an event together, it was after we did those somewhat ill-fated podcasts, and I joked that we would probably need a safe word for this event. So that safe word, as will come as no surprise, is lobster. Everyone
Jordan Peterson, for those who don't know, has a lot to say about lobsters.
So you'll know things are dire when one of us says that. But I just want to express my motive for helping to stage these events, and because I reached out to Jordan, and it really was born of seeing him in conversation with people other than myself. I saw him do a podcast with Joe Rogan. I saw him speak to Dave Rubin. I saw him speak with Brett on Rogan's podcast. And I had so much admiration for him in those
I'm going to speed it up to 1.25 just so that we are getting through some of this. Let's...
conversations. So 90% of what he said in those conversations struck me as really wise and useful and well-intentioned. And 10% didn't. And I noticed that it's clear to me that seeing these successful conversations with other people who I respect, I began to wonder that I might be the problem. And I think I am the problem.
Humble.
Well, before you applaud, maybe I didn't mean that quite the way you took it. I think it's a good sort of problem for Jordan to have, because it's what happens on those 10% moments and what doesn't happen that I think made our conversation so hard, and I think there is stuff to clarify between us. So I look forward to doing that, and thank you, Jordan, for agreeing to do this. It's an honor to share the stage with you, and needless to say, having Brett as a moderator is almost an obscene underestimation of the role he should be playing on any stage, because as you know, he's been on my podcast, and that was one of the best conversations I've ever had. So thank you for doing this, Brett.
Oh, thanks, Sam.
All right. So I'm going to jump right into it, I think. Here. So look, I put up a poll a couple of days ago to find out what people, broadly speaking, might want us to discuss. And I've been taking a look at that, and I took a lot of notes, which is why I have my computer here, by the way, and my phone. It's not to check my email while the debate's going on, the discussion. I thought what I might do is just lay out some places that I think Sam and I agree. And because there's lots of places we agree. And then I want to figure out where we disagree, which I've been trying to sort out. And then I want to see if we can hash it out a little bit and move forward on that a bit. So I'm going to lay out. See, one of the things that Carl Rogers said, the psychologist, was that a good way to have a discussion with someone is to tell them what you think until they think that what you said reflects what they said. But this is a really useful thing to know if you're ever having a discussion with an intimate partner, for example, is that you have to put their argument back to them in terms they agree with. It's very difficult. So I'm going to try to do that. And so the first thing is, I think that partly what's driving you, if this is accurate, is that you want to ground a structure of ethics in something solid. And there's two things you want to avoid, two catastrophes, let's say. One is the catastrophe that you identified with religious fundamentalism, and the other is a catastrophe that's associated with moral relativism. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good. Okay, well, no, but it's okay. So it's crucially important that we get this right now.
Yeah. Okay. This is interesting, right? Because this is kind of what I brought up in that last video. Can we go too far? And can it be where it's so morally relative that, we don't really have common ground with people in our society? But then there's the extremism, that fundamentalism. Revelation tells us the answer.
So, and that's something that I think we really agree on, because I've conceptualized that slightly different than you, and that might be relevant, but I think of that as a pathology of order and a pathology of chaos. So the terminology is slightly different, but I think we're working on the same axis. So that's the first thing.
That's an interesting way to put it. You have extreme order, where it's absolute dictator/dictate. You have to obey the letters on the page. Fundamentalism in some way, rigid. And then you have extremely open to the point where almost anything goes. And then where do you draw the line? And who says where that line is drawn?
And then in order to do that, it seems to me, that's your first priority. And then maybe your second priority is something like, you see undue suffering in the world, plenty of it. And you would think that things would be better if that wasn't the case. And that this morality, whatever it's going to be, is at least going to ground itself in part on the presupposition that the less undue suffering in the world, the better. Is that also reasonable?
Yeah, I would just add to that the positive side of the continuum as well. So as you know, the phrase I use, or the word I use for this is well-being.
Yep.
And I know from having, I don't think we spoke about this on my podcast, but from having seen you in other interviews, I think you think that phrase doesn't capture everything one could reasonably want. But I think it does. I mean, it's an elastic suitcase term for a reason, and it's actually, in reading your book, I realize there's a point of contact here, because you use the word being, capital B, being, as though it were imbued with significant gravitas, and so for me, and I agree with you, that's an appropriate use of being, and for me, well-being is simply just the positive side of being. There's the negative side, the suffering we want to mitigate, but I think however good consciousness can be in this universe, that the well-being for me subsumes all of those possibilities.
Okay. Well, so I focused on the suffering element, I think, as I
think about it too, though, like well-being for us, right? What about for animals that aren't us? This gets into a different category of dealing with morality. How do we deal with suffering beings that aren't human? There's this is why this is always going to be a debate, probably, but worth mentioning.
I've done in my own work, because I actually think it's easier to zero in on, in some sense. Like, I think it's easier for people, and I think you lay out the argument in the moral landscape kind of like this. I think it's easier perhaps to gain initial agreement between people on what might constitute a generalized ethic, to concentrate on what we don't want.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that what we do want is unimportant, but it seems to me to be harder to get a grip on. We don't want Auschwitz. We don't want the Gulag Archipelago. So, and
I would add, to just closing the door to moral relativism here, those who do want Auschwitz are wrong to want Auschwitz. I mean, obviously, Auschwitz only happened because some people did want Auschwitz, not the victim side, but the perpetrator side. And so, crucially for me is the claim that I'm a realist. I'm a moral realist, and what realism means is that there are right and wrong answers to questions of this kind, and you can not know what you're missing. In fact, we almost certainly don't know what we're missing on questions of human value, and our job is to discover just how good life can be, and just what variables are making it needlessly horrible, and to mitigate all of that and live in a better and better world.
Okay. Well, so that's a lot of points of agreement. So I also believe that there is a catastrophe of arbitrary moral injunction, and that there's a catastrophe of moral relativism, and that has to be dealt with, and that there are genuine differences between the proper way of behaving morally and the improper way of behaving morally. And I think that they are grounded in human universals, even though there's a wide amount of variation. So that's a lot of points of agreement, right? So we know that there's two things we want to avoid.
They're kind of saying the same thing in different ways. Extremism, either direction.
conceptually speaking, which is the moral relativism and this kind of moral absolutism that's grounded in an arbitrary statement of facts that you identify with religious fundamentalism. I would identify that with fundamentalism more generally, not with religious fundamentalism per se, because I see it also happening in secular states, let's say, like Nazi Germany or so it doesn't seem to be religious fundamentalism per se that's crucial to your argument.
No, it's not. So just to close the loop on that, the only reason why I would focus on religion in particular there is that religion is the only language game wherein fundamentalism and dogmatism, where dogmatism is not a pejorative concept. Dogma is a good word, specifically within Catholicism. And the notion that you must believe things on faith, that is in the absence of compelling evidence that would otherwise cause a rational person to believe it, that in a religious context is considered a feature, not a bug. Elsewhere, we recognize it to be a bug, and that's why the unique focus on religion.
All right. So is it reasonable to assume that we've already established, at least in principle, that there's an association between the totalitarian regimes, let's say,
and dogmatism, yeah,
and the dogmatism that characterizes religious belief.
Yeah.
What do you think? Although at least in principle, the secularist totalitarian states and the religious fundamentalist totalitarian states do differ in one important regard, which is that the religious types ground their axioms in God and the secular totalitarian types don't. And so there's got to be something about totalitarianism per se that's independent of, that's associated with religious belief in the manner that you just described, but that's not particularly associated with the belief in God. There's something that makes them, that's a commonality between them. And so do you have any sense of what that might be?
This great question by Jordan. This is a fundamental human issue. Beyond necessarily religion, religion may encapsulate a lot of it, and as he say, a feature of it, not a bug. So let's see what Sam says.
Well, I think one has to acknowledge that there's something uniquely pernicious, at least potentially, about religious beliefs, because they have the otherworldly variable, the supernatural variable, the you're going to get everything you want after you die, so this life doesn't matter issue. That allows for a kind of misbehavior that is especially
okay. So it seems that the claim would be that if you put forward axiomatically your claim that God exists, then you can use that claim to justify whatever arbitrary atrocities your system might throw off.
Yeah, I guess the only point I was making there is that not all dogmas are created equal. And some dogmas are on their face more dangerous and more divisive.
Right, but what I'm curious about specifically is, because it seems to me that the dogmas of the USSR and the dogmas of Nazi Germany were as pernicious as any religious dogmas, and they may also share important features with pernicious religious dogmas, but it isn't clear to me from your perspective what those commonalities would be.
Well, so, I mean, in some ways you're recapitulating an argument I've made, and this is an argument that I would make against you were you to claim, as you have elsewhere, that atheism is responsible for the greatest atrocities of the 20th century. The idea that Stalinism and Nazism and fascism were expressions of atheism simply doesn't make any sense. I mean, in the case of fascism and Nazism, it doesn't make any sense because the fascists and the Nazis, by and large, were not even atheists. I mean, Hitler wasn't an atheist, and he was talking about executing a divine plan, and he got lots of support from the churches, and the Vatican did nothing to stop him. And fascism, as you know, coexisted quite happily with Catholicism in Croatia and Portugal and Spain and Italy. So, but even in the case of Stalin, what was so wrong with that situation were all the ways in which it so resembled a religion. You had a personality cult, you had dogmatism that held sway to a point where apostasy and blasphemy were killing offenses. You know, the people who didn't toe the line were eradicated. And so to take a more modern example, North Korea is a religious cult. It just doesn't happen to be a one that is focused on the next life or supernatural claims of magic.
So what would be the defining characteristic?
Seems like humans need a little dose of critical thinking skills and the ability to critique their own in-groups, wherever that in-group is, secular or non-secular. I see this behavior of this tribalism and even almost like a blind allegiance to issues on social media with my friends who are very active. They're activist and they're political, and often right or left. And immediately, to give you just an example, I'm watching, as someone who doesn't really have a political home, I could cherry pick the same way that Sam would say you're cherry picking your ethics based on what you see works in certain systems and what doesn't work. You just neglect what doesn't work. I'm looking, and I noticed right when Charlie Kirk's situation happened, immediately people went it had to be the other side. And this came from both sides. It had to be the other side. And they would find confirming evidence to support their view to the point where they literally bash and critique the other side. And I'm sitting here screenshotting it just as like seeing myself going, okay, I could literally study this in a sense and just go, yeah, the most critical thinkers, even on the secular end, were falling prey to anything that just went, this has to be a right-winger, he has to be right-wing. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm not persuaded that's the case based on the rhetoric, based on what I've heard from other data. Do I know? I'm not there. I didn't interview the guy. I don't know the details, but they immediately went right to their group, anti-other group. So it seems like a human thing. And the leaders in those groups are like kind of the cult figures, so to speak. And they speak on behalf of the people who want to hear what they have to say.
Of a religious totalitarian movement that would make it different from a non-religious totalitarian movement.
Well,
because there's aspects that are similar.
Yeah, they're very similar. The problem is dogmatism. The overarching problem is believing things strongly on bad evidence. And and the reason why dogmatism is so dangerous is that it doesn't allow us to revise our bad ideas in real time through conversation. Dogmas have to be enforced by force or the threat of force. Because the moment someone has a better idea, you have to shut it down in order to preserve your dogma.
Okay. So the commonality seems to be something like claims of absolute truth at some level that you're no longer allowed to discuss.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's another point of agreement then, I would say, because part of the reason that I've been, let's say, a free speech advocate, although I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it, is because I think of free discourse, like the discourse that we're engaged in, as the mechanism that corrects totalitarian excess or dogmatic excess.
But by the way, that's all I wanted to do by having my friend Robert Price on to have discussions about Bible. Wasn't even interested in actually going into politics and stuff, but that was another, nope, cutting you off. And many people that were on the more liberal side, on the left side, were literally like, no, I'm not even gonna, like, they were against me. And I'm like, dude, don't watch the episode then. He's not even talking about his politics. He's literally talking about Bible. So it was unfortunate to get that kind of backlash from people who are like so dogmatic about their particular views that they have zero tolerance in communicating or even having any kind of relationship with people who are in relationships, friendships with people that they're going to have conversations about things that aren't even on the topic. It just becomes like the dogmas we find within fundamentalism, in my view.
And so I also think that systems of governance that are laying themselves out properly have to elevate the process by which dogmatic errors are corrected over the dogmas themselves, which is why I think the Americans are right, say, with regard to their First Amendment, is the process of free speech is the process by which dogmatic errors are rectified, and so it has to be put at the pinnacle of the hierarchy of values.
Yeah. And I think you and I totally agree about the primacy of free speech.
Okay, good. Okay, so that's another. Fine.
I agree.
Okay, so then there's one point that we should just lock in our gains here. It sounds like what you're saying is that the reason to fear religious dogma is really on the dogma side and not the religion side, which at least leaves open the possibility that something could exist over on the religion side that doesn't have that characteristic, right? That often they travel in tandem, but the thing to fear is not the religious belief, it is the dogmatic nature of the way it is.
So yeah, well, the other way to say that is the only thing that's wrong with religion is the dogmatism. If you get rid of I've got no problem with the buildings and the music and the paintings and
Wait a minute. That's not a trivial point, and it's not just a joke, because the buildings and the music are very important parts of the religious process. And so I know there's a humorous element to that, but it's not like Sam is throwing out the baby with the bathwater there.
And to go further than that, I've got no problem. In fact, I'm deeply interested in the phenomenology of spiritual experience. So whatever experience someone like Jesus had, whoever he was historically, or any of the other matriarchs and patriarchs of the world's religions, that phenomenology is subjectively real. I mean, it's diverse. I'm not saying everyone's had the same experience, but there are changes in consciousness that explain both how religions have gotten founded by their founders and the experiences people have had in the presence of those people or by following their methodologies that seem to be confirming of the dogmas that grew up around those traditions. And my issue is that whatever is true about us spiritually, whatever opportunity being born into this universe actually presents as a matter of consciousness spiritually, that truth has to be deeper than accidents of culture and just mere historical contingencies. The fact that somebody was born in Mesopotamia and not in China and got a different language game. So whatever is true there has to be understood in universal terms about the nature of human psychology and the human mind.
Okay, so another thing that I wanted to just point out obliquely, and then I want to return to outlining maybe where we agree, is that one of the things that was really shocking to me, I would say, was my reading of what was originally Jane Goodall's discovery about chimp behavior. Because there's this idea that was really rooted in Rousseauian thinking that the reason that people committed atrocities in the service of their group identity, let's say their tribal identity, was because culture had corrupted us. So it was a uniquely human thing. But then, of course, Goodall showed in the 1970s that the chimps at Gombe, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, would go on raiding parties, right? And so there'd be like 4 or 5 adolescent chimps, usually male, sometimes with a female in there. They would patrol the borders of their territory. If they found an interloper on the border, near the border, from another troop, even if it was a member of their troop that had emigrated, so to speak, and that they had some history with, they would tear them to pieces. And of course, that was shocking to Goodall. But and my understanding is she had some trepidations about publishing it, although she did. But then that's been noted repeatedly in other forms of chimp behavior. So, see, I've been really interested in the commission of atrocity in the service of belief, and it's tempting to pin that, say, on dogma, and then to associate that with religious dogma. I think that's all tempting. But the fact that chimps do it shows that it can't be a consequence of something like religious belief, unless you're willing to say that the reason that chimps commit atrocity in the service of their troop and their territory is because chimps are religious.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. Jordan is bringing in a very interesting point. We see animals behave, especially closest cousins to us, chimps, going out and committing atrocities, violently shredding to pieces other chimps, and this is not like random animals. These are like their own kin, right? Just different tribes. And they're doing some violence, and they're not obviously going to church on Sunday or to a mosque on a Friday, or they're not religious, it seems. We don't have any reason to think they have religions in their world, but they are committing these things. They have these patterns of behavior that are inherent to them on how they are acting. And it makes you kind of wonder, is there something fundamental about us humans beyond religion? Religion can add fuel to that fire, can be a vehicle through which violence is there, especially if God says the other guys are the bad guys, and then therefore you're almost indoctrinating yourself to go down that path. But it doesn't necessarily lead to religion equals violence, unless your doctrines and your outlook somehow is pushing that, it seems.
And so they're not religious, and they don't really hold a secular totalitarian viewpoint, but they still act out the atrocity element that's characteristic of human behavior. So to me, that makes the problem deeper than one of mere, let's say, surface statements of metaphysics.
Obviously, the problem of primate aggression, which we've inherited along with the chimps, is deeper, or at least different, than the problem of religious violence or totalitarian political structures that get the worst out of people. So, we have these primate capacities that we have to correct for, and we're busily trying to correct for almost everything that we've been evolved to do. We don't like the state of nature for good reason, and virtually everything that's good about human life is born of our, I would argue, culture-based and highly intelligent and necessary effort to mitigate what is in fact natural for us. And there's nothing more natural than tribal violence, which of the sort that you're describing in chimps.
Okay, so then it also seems like we agree that the core element of tribal alliance, which would have its roots, say, in the chimpanzee proclivity to, or its analog in the chimpanzee proclivity to identify with the dominance hierarchy of the troop, is something that's a source of the proclivity for human social aggression that's independent of its, at least independent of any obvious religious substrate. So there are other reasons for group belief and the commission of atrocity that can't be directly attributed to religious dogma.
Yeah, and what most worries me about religion, I would say, that obviously religion can channel these primate urges in unhappy ways. So you can get tribal violence that gets amplified by religious dogma.
That's kind of what I was saying earlier.
And that should trouble everyone. But it's not unique to religion. It's also nationalism, and it's racism, and it's all other kinds of dogmatism. But what most worries me are those cases where clearly good people who are not necessarily captured by tribalism per se, are doing the unthinkable based purely on religious doctrines that they believe wholeheartedly without good evidence. So you have the person who joins ISIS who wasn't even Muslim before they converted 16 months ago, and they go all the way down the rabbit hole to the the most doctrinaire, most committed, most uncompromising view of just how you have to live in this world if you're going to be Muslim. And they join ISIS based on the idea that salvation only goes one way, and that dying in defense of the one true faith is the best thing that can happen to you. There's no question that there are individuals who have made that journey. In fact, there are individuals by the thousands who have made that journey. And there are far more benign versions of that, the people who just waste their lives, I would argue, converting to whatever the belief system is and just wasting a lot of time worrying about hell or worrying about the fact that their child is gay and the creator of the universe doesn't approve of that. And there are all kinds of suffering that strike me as truly unnecessary, born not of, again, ape-like urges, but
I wish I could have a conversation with Sam. It'd be cool to have a conversation with him or Jordan at some point, just to dive into the weeds, literally, just to go deep into the weeds and try to understand, because I don't know how you can know that primate in you is not also what is going on in this religious thing. How do we know it is divorced and separate?
Ideas that any rational person would, if believed, would follow to that same terminus. I mean, the thing is, if you buy the fact, again, to take Islam as a current example, if you buy the claim that the Quran is the perfect word of the creator of the universe, never to be superseded by anything humanity does now or 1,000 years from now, that commits a rational then the exercise of human reason is bounded by this, I would argue, pathological frame, which leads to certain outcomes that should really worry us.
Okay. So let's take that claim apart for a minute, because that's not your claim specifically, the claim that you were describing. See, because that's really not the claim that religious fundamentalists make. The claim they make is worse than that, because they claim that the Quran, say, or the Bible for that matter, is the literal word of God. But more than that, they claim that their understanding of that word is correct, which means they conflate two things. Like, because you could imagine a situation where you had a book, and I'm not saying this is the case, it's an imaginative exercise, where you had a book that had all the answers, that was extraordinarily complicated. And so that when you read it, it wouldn't be obvious that you understood it. Perhaps it wouldn't be obvious that you didn't understand it either, but you're not going to be able to, you can't get an uninterpreted version of the book. And so the fundamentalist claim is far worse. It's that not only is there an absolute reality, truth, embedded in the book, but that their particular take on that absolute reality is the absolute take on that book.
That's actually what the Muslim debating Christopher Hitchens seems to have tried to imply, that the human interpreter, it is the human Muslim that is the problem, not Islam. And so he wants to get Islam off the hook, Christianity off the hook, Judaism, whatever the system of beliefs might be, and say, look, they're not bad. The books aren't bad. It's the interpreter of the books. And I would question whether or not the text actually do say some of these things, instead of just blaming it wholeheartedly on the interpreter who's negotiating with the text. I think sometimes the text just seems to be what it is.
Yeah. So they conflate their own, they make an assumption of their own omniscience and then pass that off on the gods.
Yes, except...
So it sounds like Jordan Peterson might actually be giving, again, going back to this social group, the primate group, which may have a leader who's an interpreter of how these texts should be understood. We can get back to the primate and the fundamental error being us, not the religion itself.
In their defense, and I don't often rise to the defense of fundamentalists. No.
In the defense of the fundamentalist.
It's very easy to get there because some of the claims in the book are not at all hard to parse. In fact, so many of them can only be honestly interpreted in one way. So to take, again, an example that will be not inflammatory to you, but makes the point, it just says that the remedy for theft in the Quran is to cut the hands off a thief. I mean, that is the unambiguous injunction. It's not an allegory. It's not. You have to indulge some kind of tortured interpretive scheme to avoid the shocking fact that the creator of the universe thinks you should live this way for all time. And people like ISIS. I mean, this is my claim. It's just most of what is in these books, and this is what worries me about those books because they can't be edited. Most of what's in the books is...
That is a huge problem. That there is no retake, there is no update, there is no, hey, we've learned something, let's get something new. At least not in the major framework of Islam. They have the system set in stone, and people have to negotiate with the text and reinterpret it, but not You can't just update the material.
Clearly not the best that humanity is capable of in the ethical domain or in the... No. So clearly, and this is true for morality, most pressingly, but it's true for science, it's true for economics, it's true for anything else that we are wise to pay attention to. It's like slavery is condoned in the Bible, in both Testaments, and in the Quran. There's no getting away from that. Now you can say, well, it's not the central thrust of any of these books, but if you go to the books,
that's arguable in light of the fact that the entire theology of Christianity is rooted in being a slave of Christ and having a master, and his yoke is light, his burden is easy. But you are to be a slave. That is the whole thing, to become a slave of Christ.
And try to figure out what the creator of the universe wants with respect to the owning and needless immiseration of other people, right? He expects you to keep slaves, and he's told you how to do it. Don't knock out their eyes and their teeth. If you're a Muslim, don't take other Muslims as slaves. But it's not an accident that the people who joined ISIS thought that it was absolutely kosher to take slaves, to take sex slaves. And they were even, their use of their sex slaves was conducted as a sacrament. And that's not an accident. They were praying over the Yazidi girls before they raped them. So this is not, unlike what many people expect, it's not that this doctrine is being used as a pretext for people who would otherwise do terrible things like take sex slaves and rape them. And so there's no net damage being done here by this belief system. No, these are, I would argue, in many cases, psychologically normal people who are simply convinced of the absolute veracity of these ideas. And in this case, the perfect example of Muhammad as the most self-actualized human who's ever existed. And what did Muhammad do? Muhammad took sex slaves. And so then once you grant that, and this is where there's a tension between how we pursue the same goals. Like as we've just established, we have many of the same goals. But insofar as you make religion look palatable, insofar as you suggest to your audience that they can have their religious cake and eat it too. They can have their reason, they can have their respect for science, they can have a 21st century worldview, but they can also hold on to everything they love in Christianity or fear to lose. And it's undoubtedly mostly Christianity, but whatever, any religion. My concern is that it keeps us shackled to these Iron Age philosophies and these Iron Age conversations where we should be having a 21st century conversation about everything, ethics included.
Okay, so...
God, there's a lot there. There's so much to unpack here. But yeah, I see what Sam's saying is this goes beyond just this fundamental primate issue. Like people can become delusional through the dogma and believe God actually tells them to do these things, and otherwise they're psychologically normal, and now they behave and do some of the most cruel things through religion, or do things they would never have done in the normal life. Now, he's using an extreme case of Islam, but I've seen some documentaries about like totally normal, very popular social media kids who get sucked into this little cult, and they completely break any communication and any connection with their family. They're being taught and indoctrinated by this guy. There's got to be a mixture of stuff going on here, but the dogma that is being taught seems to be persuading them somehow, even contrary to their really feeling like they want to do this. But they might be pressured. They might have psychological pressures. They might have peer pressure. They might have all sorts of different things that are going on.
Okay, but I want to ask you a little bit about your feeling.
Wait, before you move on, I want to get each of you to clarify something so that we know where we are. So Sam, you said the problem here is that the dogma can't be updated, right? That slavery is with us permanently because it's written into the dogma. But clearly, most of the traditions in which it's written into the Holy Book don't practice slavery, and the people who adhere to these belief systems wouldn't defend slavery. So clearly there is the capacity for an update mechanism.
Well, no, but not really. They've been forced, they've had it beaten out of them, right? We fought a civil war in the U.S. to get rid of slavery.
But it was Christians who abolished slavery in England, though.
What was that?
It was Christians who were at the forefront of the movement to abolish slavery in England.
There were Christians on either side of everything. There's no one else to do the job. But that's the update. Yeah. But
but it was specifically Christians who were using their Christian belief as a justification for this eradicating
but the problem was they were actually on the losing side of a theological argument. And it would be much better, I think you would agree, if one of the 10 commandments had been, don't keep slaves. There's certainly one we could swap out for that one. And so that way it would have been much easier for Christians to have fought against slavery. And it's much harder for Muslims, frankly, to fight against it now. The problem is that there's a point I made, I think, in my first book, is that the doors leading out of this kind of fundamentalism don't open from the inside. They get bashed open from the outside. And it's humanism and it's secularism and it's scientific rationality that has exerted such pressure, such winnowing pressure on Christianity, now for multiple centuries, that's why we're not encountering the Christians of the 14th century on a daily basis. And we are essentially encountering Muslims of the 14th century, not only in the Middle East, but in our own societies, in terms of their intuitions about how we should all live, right? I mean, the fact that 0% of UK Muslims think homosexuality is acceptable, right? 0%. There's almost no question you can come up with where we could poll this society and say, do you think that the lizard king is living in the Oval Office? You never get a 0% response to any poll question, right? But if you ask Muslims,
that's not good on our society, clearly.
Muslims on the streets of London, is homosexuality morally acceptable? Apparently, you can find no one who says it is. That's shocking, and it's not an accident, right? And it would be much easier if the book actually said, you can love anyone you want, and it's not a problem.
It is shocking, but I think there's a reason that you keep finding yourself at Islam, which may be the slowest to update for reasons that may be ancient. But I want to.
Well, that is a useful.
Well, I can't do it for Christianity. I want to make the point as cleanly and as undistractedly as possible. But yeah, it's true. I have the same kinds of concerns about Christianity or Mormonism or Scientology or anything else. And the point is they're all different. And there's no reason to be, because, Islam, to take the case where it's fine, Islam doesn't represent any impediment to stem cell research, right? Because they just don't think that the fertilized ovum is immediately ensouled. It waits 40 days or 80 days or 120 days, depending on what hadith you believe. So it's just that never came up when we were all complaining about how religion, in this case, Orthodox Judaism and Christianity in the States, was posing an impediment to embryonic stem cell research.
Okay, hold on. I wanted to ask you a clarifying question too. Yeah. Same level. Would you agree that there are things written into these religious texts that are unambiguously unacceptable viewed through a modern lens, and not because the texts are so complicated that we have misunderstood something, but there are things that are just written in there that we now understand to be wrong?
Good question. Let's see if Jordan Peterson, of all people, can actually answer it quickly.
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that we have to be very careful about equating all the religious texts. And I do actually think that you are careful about that, but that's something we can have a discussion about a little bit later.
I agree with you there.
So because, for a lot of my life, I was...
Dude, yes or no?
I would say more interested in the universal truths expressed in religious belief across different cultures. But I've become more and more aware of the important distinctions between the religious cultures, maybe in the last 10 years. So it isn't clear to me that you can just throw all religious dicta in the same bucket. And there's complex reasons for that. So, and one question, which you kind of sent at Sam already, is, do you see a hierarchy of unacceptability between different religious doctrines? I mean, and I would say acted. Okay, fine. So, okay. Now, but here's an interesting issue. And I think we're starting to zero in on, we've covered.
Dude, he dodged the question. He didn't even answer the damn question. I mean, he might come back to it, but man, it's a pretty simple question. Are there things in these texts that you would just say unequivocally are wrong or should not be practiced? Period.
What we agree on, a lot of it. But there's
do answer Brett's question, because I think it was
right.
Thank you.
I answered the first half of it, but the second part is, I think that
it's hard, isn't it, Jordan? It's really hard to look at an ancient book, say, some of that shit is just ancient and should not be practiced, and we should not accept it. It's morally reprehensible.
This is where I'm going to sound like a postmodernist, which
Yeah, you always do, dude. In these situations, you always do. Isn't that wild?
I hate.
Yeah.
I would say sentence by sentence, yes, you're correct. Paragraph by paragraph, perhaps. But here's...
God, what do you mean by mean? And what do you mean by what? And what do you mean by you? It's like he wants to take the whole picture and say you can't have the spot without taking the whole interpretation of the text, which, by the way, is fundamentally just not the way critical scholarship or any critical ancient material is read in a canonical hermeneutic, a systematic hermeneutic. That is always theology. That is always a faith thing to package things together to give an image, but that is not what the intended authors ever thought when they wrote this material.
Here's the problem with complicated texts, especially ones that actually constitute narratives. So imagine this. So imagine you're at a movie, and it's a movie with a twist at the end. And so the entire movie is set up to make you think one particular way and to have one set of experiences. But when you put the twist in at the end, it changes the entire structure. And so this is one of the complex problems that actually led to the rise of postmodern interpretations of literature, which is that if you take a complex narrative, there's a very large number of ways of interpreting it, and it isn't self-evident which of those are canonically correct. And we can deal with that horrible issue later, but it's a good objection, and it's true. And what it does is it makes these sorts of things quite complicated, because in the Bible is a series of books, and they had influence on one another, and they were sequenced with a very complex editorial process, and there's actually a developmental narrative that links all the chapters together. And what that means,
could have simply been a redactor at some point connecting material. Not that the original intended authors had that in mind necessarily.
I'm going to speak from the perspective or intention.
And by the way, some of this material contradicts other material. It's written against or to whitewash earlier bad stuff. Take Kings and Chronicles. I mean, this needs to be, and then 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, like when you go through this material, in one, David is horrible, and another, David is glorious and great, and he's not anything like he's painted before. So they don't even agree often.
In terms of analysis of the Christian Bible, what it means is that you have to read the beginning as if it's also influenced by the end, which is what, by the way, and in case you think that I'm weaseling around here. And
you are weaseling around. Let's be honest, bro. That's exactly what you're doing.
I'm not, is that's exactly what you do every time you read any story, any work of fiction.
Yeah, but even then, they're unified, single narrative works of fiction. You would not pick up Harry Potter and then run to a whole different text and read it and say, hey, this connects to that. There's a development, of course, building upon earlier material, but you have to understand it in this way. So it's like, if you're going to, in some fictive way, tie in all this material that way, then you're literally abusing some of the earlier texts. You know, I have scholars who I interview on the Gospel of Mark, James Tabor, and he'll say, you got to read Mark as Mark. But if you have to read Mark in light of Matthew, Luke, and John as if they tell you what Mark means, you have abused Mark, and you do not understand Mark. This is the problem, right? If you want to go, look, I prefer this picture of connecting through a Christian lens, theologically, that is what I do, and in that light, I think there's a way to justify or explain away some of the problems, but in reality, there's really a lot of problems with the text itself, where it sits in its original context. Then you're just being straight up honest. Sounds like you're doing wishy-washy stuff because it's what you're doing.
You say, well, you're not claiming that the Bible is a work of fiction. It's like, don't. That's just a cheap objection. That's not my point. My point is that it's a narrative, and everything in a narrative is conditioned by all the rest of the things in the narrative. And it is well known. Like if you're a screenwriter, for example, there's an old dictum. I don't remember who generated it. It was one of the great Russians. That if there's a rifle lying on a table in the first scene, that it better be used by the end of the second scene, or it shouldn't have been there at all. So there's this coherence.
I'm looking for the rifle in your answer to this question,
yeah.
and I want it to be used.
Yeah.
My point is that...
Yeah, thanks, Sam. He wants it to be used because you're doing all sorts of games.
It isn't reasonable to take a single sentence out of a coherent narrative and say that stands on its own, or it's rarely reasonable, because you have to interpret the word in the sentence and the sentence in the paragraph and the paragraph in the chapter and the chapter in the context of the entire book. You have to do that. Now, you could object, and reasonably so, that there are some sentences that are so blatant that you can't use context to paraphrase them, let's say. But I think you also have to give the devil its due. The Christian Bible is a developmental narrative, and the beginning has to be read in light of the end. And is it a fact?
Well, so what does that do to Moses's laws of war? this is not a narrative. This is instructions about what to do when you invade a foreign land.
Peterson can find ways to make anything mean anything.
If you intend to take over that land, you kill everybody, right? There are other rules in there about killing husbands and taking the wives.
Yeah, the New Testament's a brutal document.
Absolutely brutal. So my point would be, I don't know that reading that portion.
Sam's like, go ahead, man. Go ahead. Take over, because you're getting to something. Let's hope Jordan can answer your question.
In light of the end, even if you call the end the New Testament, I don't know that it changes Moses' laws of war and their acceptability.
Well, hypothetically, if you take the New Testament seriously, it does, because it's a document that supersedes it. And I think there's actually technical reasons.
So it doesn't supersede it on every point. I mean, this is a problem. Slavery is a very straightforward case, because clearly the Bible thumpers of the South who were defending slavery with reference to the text felt they were on firm ground. And I would invite anyone to read what the New Testament and the Old Testament say about slavery to see that they were on fairly firm ground. The balance of the honest reading was on the side of, clearly we can keep slaves, right? Jesus never envisioned a world without slavery, and he admonished slaves to serve their masters well and to serve their Christian masters especially well.
The English Protestants wouldn't have agreed with that, because, like I said, they were at the forefront of the fight against slavery.
Okay, but
I think there was a range
influenced by something outside the text, and this is, again, you're making this harder than it is, and my concern is why. Right?
Well, I don't think I am, Sam, because I think that the fundamental message in the New Testament, for example, is that.
So then you're individual. The Old Testament. So Jews are in possession of a book that has some diabolical passages that would be better left out. You're not going to offend me.
It's not like look, in the Old Testament itself, in the Jewish Bible, there's also the seeds of the same tension. So, for example, there's a tension, and this would be a tension that's of interest to you, because you've stated quite clearly in your book, in the Moral Landscape, that you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater with regards at least to religious phenomenology. You said that, for example, I still consider the world's religions to be mere intellectual ruins maintained at enormous economic and social cost, but now I understood that important psychological truths could be found in the rubble. Well, I'm trying to find the important psychological truths in the rubble.
Yeah, but that's all you're trying to find. And Sam's trying to say, can you find any rubble? And tell us about the rubble. What's the bad stuff that seems to be in this material? And it's like you're only looking for the good in defense of it. And for some reason, I feel like Jordan Peterson feels that the Bible, the mythic construct of the Bible, Christianity, is foundational for our society to function properly. So back to the beginning of this back and forth that was going on between fundamentalism and completely subjective morality, and anything goes. Anyone can make up the rules as they go. So there's this tug of war between, we got all the rules, everything's strict and it's strong, to much, much more liberal outlook. It seems like Jordan would lean more into the mythos of Christianity and the Bible as a foundation for our society, and he's afraid of picking at it and being overly critical, as if you get rid of this, then you have to go to the other side and it's just full on, all things go and it's chaos. And I don't think that that's the case. I don't think you need that. That's what I feel like when I'm listening to him defend and find ways to keep his mythos alive. It could be other factors. His constituency is extremely conservative and also very Christian. There might be all sorts of elements and layers to the cake, but that's what I feel like Jordan's doing, is he's doing everything he can to keep that foundation, that Christian, biblical, traditional foundation, and off of that, we have a society that will be functional, working, et cetera, et cetera.
But we have to decide also if we agree about that. Like, are there important psychological truths to be found in the rubble?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so then we can't.
But the problem with Revelation, this notion of Revelation, this notion that some books weren't written by smart people, they were written by God, confines you to taking the whole text, even though this text was cobbled together over centuries, and for whole centuries, some books were in the New Testament and then they got thrown out centuries later, and some books weren't in and then got put in. So it's an all too human process that got us these books in the first place. But once they were set, believers imagine that
that was a really obviously Sam's not an expert when it comes to understanding the development of the canon. I think his point still stands that humans decided cobble together the canon, etc., and how they came about choosing what material, all of that. But I just think the way he worded that, I could hear someone like Wes Huff making a hit piece on it. Oh, he's so wrong. I study papyrus. Look at the papyrus. I made a remake of the Book of Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas. I did a facsimile here and all that kind of stuff. And it's like Sam gave a layup to these kind of guys to get pedantic.
Stuck with every passage, and there are passages in the Old Testament that tell you to stone a girl or a woman who's not a virgin on her wedding night, take her to her father's doorstep and stone her to death, right? We can
probably agree that those are wrong. So
yeah, there's another point of agreement. But you don't have to read the book to the end to know that it's wrong. You can get that from the paragraph.
Come on now.
Yeah, but
come on. What are you going to say back to that, Jordan?
Isn't what I said. I didn't say you had to read to the end of the book to know that it's wrong. I said you needed to read to the end of the book to contextualize those statements within the whole. I didn't.
Do you really need to?
But there's no exculpatory context to those kinds of statements, and that's.
Well, there is in the Old Testament. There's a real tension, and this is, I think, the tension that would be of interest to you. There's a tension between the dogmatic and the prophetic traditions, and I think to the degree that you're interested in religious phenomenology, you find yourself on the side of the prophetic tradition, and the prophetic tradition has implicitly in it, what would you call an implicit damnation of those dogmatic. Those cruelly dogmatic rules. You see that emerge all the time.
Arguably in Christianity. I think.
In Judaism, it's clearly there in the Old Testament.
I was going once again to Islam, but every prophetic. The notion of prophecy is.
I think Sam's wise to go to Islam. For those who might not like that he does that, you got to understand, Jordan is a somewhat Christian man. Okay. He doesn't like when the Bible gets attacked. He's happy to talk about Islam. And so Sam needs to use a text that he's not going to get defensive over. It seems he's not going to be overly protective on. Sad part is, I've studied enough of the Quran to know that if he actually studied the Quran the way he likes to engage with the Bible, he could do the same thing with the Quran. But I don't see Jordan Peterson making defenses of the Quran, using the same methodology he does for Bible.
Dangerous and worth worrying about. The idea that any ancient book contains in it a perfect description of rightly interpreted, however difficult to interpret it. If you're only smart enough, you could extract from this text a perfect window onto the future, right? And that whole generations of people have lived by the lights of this cockamamie idea. Right, that the world is going to end, and this ending is going to be glorious. Right, this is at the center of most eschatologies. It's just that when the wheels come off totally, right, that's on some levels the best thing that's ever going to happen, because it's showing you that in this case Jesus is going to come back and throw the sinners into a lake of fire. And I've read to the end of the book. It's pretty scary at the end as well. Revelation is
it's pretty scary at the end as well, huh?
Yeah, no kidding. Well, that's a really good objection. But, when I did my lectures on the Bible last year, I said they provided a psychological take on the biblical lectures. And that's what I'm going to attempt to maintain here, because I don't believe that I'm qualified to make fundamental metaphysical statements. But the scene that's delimited out at the end of Revelations, that's a very interesting book read psychologically, because what it
Well, you're anything. This is we should talk about.
Well, let me just address that. I'll only take a minute and I'll try to be succinct. So there's an idea that's expressed in that book, is that it's something like things are always falling apart in a fundamental manner. It's built into this. There's an apocalyptic element to human life. We fail in small ways and we fail in catastrophic ways, and everything that we have, we lose and we die. So and societies come to an end. There's an apocalyptic element built into the structure of human reality. And part of what's revealed in that strange book at the end, which is like a hallucinogenic nightmare in some sense, is that the hero is born at the darkest point in the journey. And it's a psychological truth, and it's very, very apt, because at the darkest point, this is also why Christ is born near the darkest time of the year from a metaphysical perspective. There's an idea there that when things fall apart, that's the time for the birth of the hero. And the hero in Revelation is also the place where truthful speech most clearly manifests itself, because in the Christian tradition, Christ is identified with truthful speech. And so the notion there is that redemption under apocalyptic conditions is to be found in the revelation of truthful speech.
Oh my God. How many, if I picked apart what he just said and spent 20 minutes dissecting all that he just did there, it's a bit anachronistic to place the birth at the winter solstice, but nonetheless they did. But they did this for Sol Invictus as well. So was this a generic, some hero in the dark time of the year? You have your God, your Sol Invictus, your your Jesus Christ born at the darkest time of the year. And yeah, I'm sure there is some theological point there. And to have them gravitate to the solstices and the equinoxes was common. Attis dies in Easter and resurrects after 3 days. You literally have dying and resurrecting in Easter for so many various deities. And by the way, we're documenting even more. Me and Neil from Gnostic Informant, we have more to bring to the list. Heracles, also Melkart, Heracles. Josephus talks about this, that there's a celebration of the festival of his death and resurrection in Easter. There's so much, man. People just don't know that mythically you find these patterns. But I don't want to cut him off, but I just want to say, like, he's doing so much interpretation here, and I can find meaning and value in this stuff. Don't get me wrong, but I can also quickly go, yep, nope, that's bullshit. Nope, that's bullshit. Nope, that's wrong. Nope, that's not right. Yep, that we should probably forsake that. Nope, I could see why Christians reinterpreted that. Yada, yada, yada. But not like, he doesn't see that, it seems. At least to me, he doesn't seem like he sees it. Let's see. Go back.
In Revelation is also the place where truthful speech most clearly manifests itself, because in the Christian tradition, Christ is identified with truthful speech. And so the notion there is that redemption under apocalyptic conditions is to be found in the revelation of truthful speech, which is something that you actually believe.
Well, I believe in truthful speech, but I also believe that you can play this kind of interpretive game with almost any text. This way of
But then you could do it with the world, Sam, and that wreaks havoc with your value from facts argument.
No, actually, I didn't hear what you just said. What was that?
Well, I said you can make exactly the same objection with the world of facts. Is there's an infinite number of facts and there's an infinite number of potential interpretations, and so tracking the pathway from the fact to a value is actually impossible. It's the same argument with regards to biblical interpretation.
We should talk about that, but that I don't think that's a good analogy. There are more and less plausible interpretations of any situation, any data, and any text, arguably. But the problem is that you can read into any story some apparently meaningful set of psychological insights,
But you can do that with any set of facts too.
Well, no. I mean, there are certain things you can't over-interpret to your heart's content and come out any way you choose. My point is that first of all, this is why fundamentalism always has an edge over more sophisticated theology.
We're going to come back to that. Let me know what you think so far. This is part one of us in part one. Sam Harris versus Jordan Peterson. Holy moly, they're getting in the weeds. Hit the subscribe button and check that bell if you want to be notified of more videos like this. We could really use the help. And drop a comment on what you think just happened during this discussion. Where are you at? What do you think? Jordan Peterson is on the right track. Sam Harris, are they both wrong? Let me know in the comments. Like the video, share it out there. And until next time, see you then.